Welcome to the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark, where we constantly remind you that love is greater than fear and happiness is resistance. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. This is your host, Lonnie Clark, with the Age of Fission radio show. I want to introduce to you our brand new co-host, Heide Lambert. I met Heidi a few years ago through our efforts with No Nukes Northwest. And Heidi, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Lonnie. This is exciting.
This is exciting. I reached out to Heidi to be my co-host because she has a very interesting background and understands nuclear contamination at a very personal level. She grew up around Hanford. Her dad was a nuclear scientist. And I want her to tell us a little bit about her story today so that we can understand the depth of her knowledge. And Heidi, if you would, go into your education, because that's unusual, too, for a female, to be honest. And I love it.
So I have a unique background because my dad worked at Hanford. But before that, both my parents were raised in Eastern Washington. So I have a really unique perspective of what it was like to grow up beside an atomic site and a waste site, and how, like, watching that evolve as a family of farmers. But what was really unique, too, about my dad was that he was really scientific. So he came from a farming family, and then he actually experienced Vietnam as a soldier, and then came back and then was put through school so that he could stay close to home and still farm, but he also could get a job that was really well-paying out of Hanford. And my mom was from Yakima, and her family were merchants. They weren't farmers, although my grandpa did have a chicken farm in Goldendale for a while. But, so I was raised by these farmers, and what ended up happening was my mom married my dad, thinking she was going to have this kind of fancy life to this smart scientist. But when he worked out at Hanford in the 70s, it ultimately ended up with him having a mental breakdown, and he wouldn't work for Hanford anymore. And so my family relocated over to Seattle. And then I was exposed to all kinds of things in the 80s and 90s in Seattle, like a lot of prejudices towards Eastern Washington, but then seeing how nukes were being used in Western Washington, like with the Trident nuclear submarine, and like we can go on and on.
Yeah,
but anyway,
I want to ask you, what do you mean prejudice against Eastern? What are you talking about?
Because when you were on the west side of Washington, they would make jokes about how Eastern Washington was contaminated. And there was like this kind of strange knowledge about Hanford being this neglected waste site. And that's kind of like the birth of the Simpsons with like the engineer eating donuts. You know what I mean? It was kind of like, oh, those dumb farmers over there. It was a weird prejudice that I was raised with. But then at the same time, in Seattle, I was seeing a lot of neglect and a lot of like bad choices. And again, the example I would have is the nuclear submarine. They're like bringing the nuclear submarine through the Puget Sound, and there was a lot of waste, and there was a lot of mistakes and accidents that went untold, and people got sick and animals died. And so I was kind of raised, I guess what I'm trying to say is kind of with a prejudice against Washington. There was no division of which side was smarter or better than the other side. And my dad, after he left Hanford, he was really just opposed to nuclear science altogether. So I had like his perspective. But again, I was raised believing my dad was crazy and that what he believed was crazy. So it took me about 2 decades.
Who told you that he was crazy?
Well, legally he was crazy, Lonnie. Like, he was diagnosed with all sorts of things, and was
you mean from his
disabled.
Doctors at Hanford when he worked from Hanford?
Well, and then he was a VA, so it wasn't even just Hanford doctors. It was federal doctors. It was government doctors. Right. And so there was all of that, and then there was just like our family and the family's understanding of what had happened, and so I was raised with like a lot of shame and a lot of secrets. It felt like I had a lot of secrets growing up. and it was mostly about Hanford, and it was about conspiracy, or about, the government not caring for people and the people being experimented on, and those were big thoughts for a little kid in the 80s and the 90s. And so
well, it's kind of like this show. We air on KEPW at 7:30 in the morning, and there are children that might be listening, and so talking about this is heavy stuff for even children. And this is partly why I wanted you to join me, because you have kids and you're a mom. You grew up there. You understand the anxieties of what it means to be a child listening to these things. And you're awesome. You've grown up to be an awesome human being. So I'm glad that you're joining us.
Well, thank you. Well, you can either I think it was you, Lonnie, who told me there's two kinds of courage, right? There's the courage to die, and there's the courage to live, and that stuck with me. I think it was a Hiroshima survivor that you were quoting when you told me that.
Yeah, I watched a documentary about the survivors of Hiroshima, because most of them, or many of them that we now listen to who can speak, were children at the time.
Yeah, so that's kind of, they're older than me. I was a kid in the 70s, but the 70s, you got to remember, Hanford was very top secret. It was like the largest top secret case in the U.S. So it was I grew up in a decade of a lot of secrecy and a lot of everyone trying to be normal so that no one would be suspicious. And it was just a really weird era in the Tri-Cities. And eventually, so we moved to Seattle. I grew up, and I ended up going to Olympia to go to school at the Evergreen State College. And that was one of the coolest experiences of my whole life. And I actually was an artist, and I was going back and forth between art and science. And Matt Groening, actually, he graduated from the Evergreen. And he also had a life of going back and forth between Eastern Washington and Seattle. And so
You mean Matt Groening, the guy from Simpsons?
Yeah. The Simpsons was really kind of born from the Evergreen State College, from Matt Groening, from his experiences in Washington. And that was the first time in my life that I really felt a lot of validation that things were as crazy as that I thought they were, And so so I ended up getting my degree in animation as well. And then went on through my life to get married and have kids, and now I work with kids. And it's just interesting because I know that Hanford was built without a solution. Like it's a science that they don't have answers for. It's kind of just like it is a gigantic experiment. And so that's how I teach my children about it, that there is this science that is new and pretty man-made, and it's creating all of these different causes and effects. And so some of it can be really scary, of course, and then when Fukushima happened, that was a huge impact.
It woke a lot of us up. But this is my thing. I think, in fact, this was my comment at the Hanford at the meeting that they had on October 16th. I've said this a few times on my radio show since then, because I believe it's very real. My comment is not, we need to start cutting money. We need to spend a lot more money at Hanford and the nuclear waste sites. We need to stop neglecting it. We need to pour money into it. And so to do that, we need to have universal health care, so that if you get sick, you can go to the doctor and there's no more denying that, yes, you're sick from contaminants, either nuclear or chemical, because we have a technology-based society. And frankly, it wasn't well managed the first 100 years. And oops, sorry, we are contaminated. So let's just get people health care. And then we need universal education. People need to be able to go to college. If you are a brilliant scientific mind, you should be able. We need scientists. There's a lot of really smart kids right now in America that are not learning math and science and not going to college, not becoming nuclear scientists. We need a lot more. We need to build a whole industry around nuclear science and how to remediate and reverse and fix this, because it's not just the radioactive contaminants, it's the chemical contaminants. I mean, the more you dig into it, you realize it truly is a complicated situation. But I believe that our
It is, but
children can
it's
find solutions if they have the education.
well, I do believe there will be solutions, but I do believe that it's so holistic. It's such a holistic issue, Lonnie, and we think of it as being this really tiny atomic issue and like really contained, and like there's all these scientists with these rubber gloves with these tanks, doing experiments, but in fact, it's evolved past that, and that's where, like, we do need scientists, but we need people who can think for themselves. It's really important right now that people can really critically think about things and think of it in a holistic way, because as Hanford has proven to me in the last, 4 decades, is that it's not contained, and that they put, gallons and gallons of waste of all different kinds of consistency and all kinds of different degrees of waste in these tanks. And then now they've eaten through these tanks and they're sitting on the ground. And even not only do they not have tanks in the beginning, they just had trenches.
Right.
You had these like 50, 60-foot trenches where they just put the waste right in the ground.
Or the tunnels. That's in fact what happened yesterday.
That is what a tunnel is. Yeah.
I mean, they basically buried big truckloads of trucks, literally trucks and car trains. This is the stunning thing to think about. Like, in St. Louis, one of the big things that they had to do there was they literally had buried whole train loads of uranium there. In the train. The whole thing. They shipped it there and just stuck it in the ground. So the government did spend, I think they spent 15, 16 years clearing up Coldwater Creek. And the people there are very proud of the work that had been done and their efforts. And many of their families are still negatively affected, but they love their area. They're very dedicated to it. And there's another area, the Westlake landfill, that's just now being acknowledged. It's kind of a runoff from that, like some waste was illegally sold and dumped in 15 miles away from there, right? So it created its own little eyesore that around 300,000 people. So,
but even the way we were talking about it right now is that it's this like contained eyesore, these little pieces. But really, what we don't understand is that the wind, the rain, the rivers.
I mean, the Missouri River, the Mississippi River.
The Columbia River.
The Columbia River. I mean...
Yeah. Willamette. We're all affected by these.
Although they tell us that the Columbia River is perfectly safe to swim in, and it's got acceptable levels of radioactivity, that there's never that much radioactivity that's very bad in there.
So because I think that I did grow up in a area, a government-ran area that ran these kind of nuclear sites, is that they're wordsmiths. They're very good with how they use their verbiage, Lonnie. Like that's I think how I began having a doubt for media and understanding how propaganda was used. If there's anyone that uses propaganda, it's the nuclear science field, and trying to sell us, first they sold us that we needed it to end World War II, and then we needed it for power, and now they're selling it to us as medicine. Now we need it for medicine. One of the most radioactive wastes on the road right now is medical use waste. And it's still waste. That's the thing, is this nuclear waste will be around for thousands and thousands of years. But they're still trying to justify that it's safe and it's containable.
Hundreds of thousands of years. Plutonium's half-life is 27,000. That's its half-life. To get it to the point where it's no longer radioactive, it's slightly over 300,000 years.
So I think that growing up with the paradox of having a dad who was a farmer and a scientist, who really taught me to be a farmer and a scientist, was really to look at things more holistically, really look at our food and like, what is our dirt? What is our water? How do we make our food? How do we feed? And then there's that whole other level of feeding the food. So like you grow the grains, but then the grains go to the animals, and then you drink the animal's milk, or you're vegan, and then you're still eating the plant. It just started making me really realize how our food was exposed, and animals, insects, and all of that. It made me just so curious.
Well, this is why I think we need a truth and reconciliation panel like they had in Africa. I think it was in South Africa, where those tribes were chopping each other up, and they had like a panel where they said, you can come forward, tell us what you know, tell the truth, and then say you're sorry, make an effort to be peaceful and live in society peacefully. I believe that we have two sets of types of, and I would be curious about your take on this, because your dad was very much against, he saw it from the inside out. I think in order for us to get to the place where we can have universal health care and universal school and an acceptance of the major mistakes they have made in the nuclear industry, in terms of neglecting what to do with this catastrophic byproduct called nuclear waste. And
so they did do that. They did start this panel in the 70s. So because Hanford was top secret, you know about the Green Run, right, in the 50s, where they
yes, but you want to know what? This is the thing. We need a change of culture, not just the United States. The IAEA runs the show. There is a scientific study conducted, and I will keep talking about it. I'm going to get the title of it. It's a big, long thing. It says the safety culture, the safety of the IAEA safety culture model. And it was a group of 6 scientists in Spain who tested. They were 3 separate groups that tested it in different ways. And they have 8 markers of radioactive safety in the world. Every single nuclear facility uses this safety culture model. And that... Right. They discovered it had never been empirically tested. It had never been tested. Not one time. They'd never put it to use in a single facility. They just wrote up a bunch of stuff. And that was what...
The different rates. They chose the rates, what doses.
It's not even just rates. It's like how you report to your boss, how you identify problems, the different rates that they do. I read the whole scientific study on my YouTube channel, and because I'm not a scientific brain, oh my God, I was bored out of my head, and I had to read things several times just to comprehend it.
Right.
I have almost
That's
400.
part of the game, It is. It's part of the game is that they think that only smart people can do it, but it's not true.
But we did get through it, and you know what the nuts and bolts of that scientific study was? They failed on all the 8 markers that they had. The only marker that passed at 50% was the employees felt confident enough to talk to their boss that they saw a real problem. That was it. Not on how you resolve it, not on how you write it up, not on how you do anything else. This is why we have a culture. We have a culture at the International Atomic Energy Agency floating down to every nuclear facility of don't talk about the problems or you're going to lose your job. Go along with it. If you want to work here, you accept the risk and keep your trap shut. Secrecy and
it's part of that shift. It's part of that shift of being top secret, super secluded. Everybody went to their own buildings and did their own work, and then they never really knew how their work amounted together. It wasn't until the 70s, I truly believe that after they did the Green Run and did all these experiments after World War II, people were dying like crazy, left and right. Everyone was dying. And that's when in the 70s that people were insisting to know what the hell was going on. People really didn't know. And in the 70s, there was some sort of document release. There was after documents are hidden for so long, I don't know if it's 25 or 30 years.
That's why I found that from Dr. Alvin Weinberg. It was released. He wrote it. Yeah. It was released in 2010, but in 1972 he gave this discussion to a very small group of nuclear scientists in Colorado. And he called themselves, for the first time, he used 2 phrases for the first time. He called themselves the nuclear priesthood in this document. He also admitted that they knew it was going to kill people, and if people knew, they wouldn't like it. But then he said, we've entered into a Faustian bargain with the world because they need us now.
Yes, exactly. And this is this twist that we're in, is that nuclear science will never advance without help of people. Like you said, our kids are the future. They got to understand this. But there's still so much secrecy and there's still so much fraud. It's just straight up lies to people about it.
Yes.
And sadly, that's kind of what's happened to our whole culture right now. Nobody knows what the truth or what is lies. And
well, that's not true. Let's be clear, Heidi. You and I, we know what the truth is. We can tell. Well, you can tell as adults, if you have a good sense of self-love and self-esteem, you have a good gut intuition of what the big pack. I mean, this is why I don't get hysterical about nuclear energy, because I could actually see that if we could figure out how to deal with this byproduct called nuclear waste, how to do something with it. They have never really been able to figure out how to remediate it or how to reverse the molecules, because it costs billions and billions and billions of dollars to pour into these machines that don't work. You have to make another machine and another machine.
Oh, sure.
And that's what costs the cost.
I mean, think of it this way, is that to make atomic energy, you're literally taking atoms and you're breaking them apart. And when you do that, there's all these different electrons, these loose electrons. That's what's uncontainable. These electrons are looking for their original atom. They're trying to get back together. And so that's this whole problem with waste, is it goes towards water and it tries to attach, that electron goes onto water. And then when we drink our cup of water, we don't know if there's little random extra electrons or not in our water. See what I'm saying? It's even in our air. It's in our world. And we've released it for over 100 years now. Well, it's like an invisible poison.
That's right.
It's so invisible, and nobody knows. And then not only is it invisible, our culture is so used to lying to us that they blame it on everything else. Like, I personally believe a lot of people died from lung cancer because of atomic poisoning.
Yes.
But cigarettes got blamed because that was what we did as individuals. So our actions as individuals got blamed, not the actions as masses got blamed. You know what I mean? Like, nobody looked at the atomic air as being the culprit.
That's the same thing with blaming the junk food or your pharmaceuticals or whatever it is. Because they do also cause cancer. They also do all that. But the thing is, there's been no scientific studies. For example, I have been involved with KEPW's fundraiser this month. They've had several events. And I met Norman Solomon yesterday. And he wrote a book with Noam Chomsky called Killing Your Own. I believe that's the title of it. And I said, that right now and they were talking about the nuclear waste and all this chemical waste and how we're actually, the only country who bombed our own people during the nuclear testing sites. Right. And this is what came out with that activism in the 70s and 80s when people realized, oh my gosh, they weren't taking care of us. But this is my point is, I asked him, why aren't the nuclear climate activists jumping up and down at the nuclear radioactivity? There is no way that is not affecting the environment negatively. It is speeding up the warming. When you think about it, it's killing the microscopic levels. And surprisingly enough, he did not know who Dr. Chris Busby was, which tells me that these climate activists are not even paying attention to the nuclear catastrophes going around us. And the people, because Dr. Busby actually, if he had been following the nuclear veterans and the nuclear people, he would have paid attention, because Dr. Busby is a scientific expert who presents himself.
I would say leading scientific expert, at least from the research I've seen with his
on the epidemiological studies of human beings. And he's actually the cool thing about Dr. Busby is he's one of the few people who has unequivocally won in court. And he is well respected.
Didn't he just get raided?
Yes, they did this just to harass him, too.
They hated him.
Yes, they
I love Busby. He did this amazing study that I read, Lonnie, about insects of Chernobyl. And he showed or proved that it was like 5+ generations that really mutations came out. That the first, second, third, it would be like maybe different eye colors. Like that was when he went on to birds. He started showing that there was a lot of like blue-eyed and brown-eyed birds. But then they started having like defects in their feathers, and then as generations went on, and so I think that is what's so interesting, is that this science is so new. We really don't know how it's going to affect us generations later, you know.
Well, the reason that we don't have a lot of scientific studies is, I mean, Dr. Busby recently got raided. People are afraid of the cops.
Right.
I mean, he
no,
didn't...
my dad totally was paranoid. Or, I mean, they called it paranoia. He was afraid for his life. He was afraid for our lives. He swore he knew scientists who went missing. I don't think that that's a myth. I think that in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, the U.S. government was doing all kinds of things to try to keep their secrets and lives.
I remember a recent story from a Canadian. Thomas Ackerman was talking about this young man in his community who worked for some industry, and he was getting hip to Fukushima and what was going on and asking questions. And his parents, it was a weird thing. He disappeared, and in less than a week, his parents gave him a wake and a funeral and said bye-bye. They never found his body, but the parents cooperated. So it was really weird. You know, things happen. So we don't know. But that's my point, Heidi, is our generations, we need them to be able to go to school. We need people to get well. But I also don't believe that people in the industry need to go to jail for a long time. That does not fix it. What we really need is a change of culture, of humanitarian culture at the people at the top, where we say, look, this is the bottom line. Truth and reconciliation.
I kind of would like to see the CEOs of Exxon and, you know, Lockheed Martin. I wouldn't hurt my feelings if they went to jail.
But if we did that, they would never cooperate, right? But maybe we should do that. Maybe one or two people can be held accountable, but then where does it go? Because, you know, the people that should be held accountable are all dead. It's kind of, you know, I mean, like Henry Kissinger. Do you think we'd ever get Henry Kissinger in jail? No.
It's true.
He does
also
deserve it.
You talk about like how much money it takes, you know, and that I think is the part that makes me really jaded, because I think the nuclear science gets a ton, like they get $1 million a day, billions of dollars has been spent there. Mm-hmm. And because they don't have a solution, they're like spending all this money, like you're saying, they're spending money trying to find solutions. But part of me is really suspicious about the management of money. And if there is a lot of mismanagement, I feel like there's too much money going to the top and not enough going to the actual boots on the ground, you know.
That's the point about the Truth and Reconciliation program. No more lying. You guys have made them enough money. You get enough billions. We're taking money away from you, and we're going to develop science. Like this whole thing of just pouring money down the drain. So
this is what I know, Lonnie, that did happen. So in the 50s and 60s, everyone's dying like crazy. Everything's secret. And in the 70s, they did get a hold of those documents, and they did realize that they were poisoning the people. And most of them were indigenous people, to be honest. They hurt the worst. And so they did create this thing called the Tri-Party Agreement. And the Tri-Party Agreement was the idea that there would be checks and balances. They put the tribes together with the Department of Ecology and the Department of Energy, or I think it's actually called Department of Defense. But those three departments do meet like quarterly. For like 25 years, these guys have been meeting, and they are supposed to be like, truth on the table, this is the mess we have, this is how we're going to clean it up, this is, you know what I mean? They're the people who are managing like the permits to the Hanford site.
Actually, that's what, there was a Yakama Nation, and Representative Pollitt from Washington was at this meeting last week. I posted the comments on my YouTube channel, and I have to admit, I just did it on my cell phone, so it wasn't like the best audio of it, but I wanted to have it up. I decided to post it anyways, because even if it was bad videography and sound, and you could hear my little side comments, what they stated was this exactly. Like, the government right now, the federal government is insisting, and this is the weird thing, their studies that they have conducted, they did order their studies. Their studies are not finished until mid-December, but they're closing public comment on November 7th. So they're asking
before we even see the results of the studies.
Yes.
Okay. So
and people at the meeting were like, "You agreed to protect us. This was you have been doing this. So now, what has caused you to want to change that?" We never got an answer. Like, why do you want to leave 62,500 gallons of the most toxic radioactive sludge waste in the ground, pour concrete on it, and say it's low-level radioactive contamination? They've signed contracts to the opposite.
Because if they bury it and walk away from it, they think that it's gone. They don't realize that it's not gone. It takes one earthquake to make that a really bad story. You know what I mean? Like, it's so, and I feel for the tribes, Lonnie. I feel so hard for the tribes because they have been nothing but lied to and murdered forever. And then we're still trying to bring them to the table and tell them that we're still trying to fix it. It's like, how many times do you have to tell a liar you know that they're lying to you before you don't even want to go to the table anymore? You know what I mean?
I know. Well, that's the thing, is with, if you understand narcissism, you go gray. You do not respond to the liars and the lies. You just ignore them completely. But in this case, we cannot. There is no battered, that's what I said last night on my radio show. There is no battered country shelter to go to. Like, we are a battered country. But the only way out of this is through it. And that is through standing up and doing what's right. And that's, and this is why I really love our idea on our 3/11 commemoration ceremony. This year we started it with No Nukes Northwest. We meet at Amanda's Trail. Where's that city off of the Oregon coast?
So Amanda's Trail is off of Yachats, Oregon, which is in the Siuslaw National Forest, and it's Cape Perpetua is the big landmark. It's called Cape
worth
Perpetua.
It, you guys. If you're here in Eugene, Oregon, make your way there. In Springfield, go and do that hike, and you can plan on joining us on 3/11 because Heidi and I are going to do this every commemoration on Fukushima Day. That's what I call it.
Yeah, it was actually, that actually was inspired by my daughters.
That's awesome.
To be honest with you, because Amanda's story was that she was an indigenous person being relocated, and she was blind, and Perpetua's coastline is all like black lava, and it's really rough, and so the soldiers reported that her feet were like being cut off of her body because the ground was so abrasive. And so they took her up this path to cross this Perpetua. It's kind of like a mountain range, I guess, a coastal mountain range, which was really high. Actually, it's like 2,000 feet high. But Amanda had to hike behind these horses barefoot with bloodied feet, blind, and had no idea that she was walking this cliff. And had anything gone wrong, she would have plummeted to her death. And my daughter's idea was to start at the top of Perpetua and walk down the trail blindfolded, and I was horrified, and I was like, no, we'll just close our eyes for some of it, because it's so steep. But the whole hike was so wonderful to think about how we are so blind when it comes to nuclear science and how we all are walking this cliff, and we're just trusting our leaders that they're leading us to safety. But in honesty, at any minute, we could all be plummeting to our death. And when we got to the bottom, we met Amanda, the statue of Amanda, and she's just this tiny little thing. And I just thought that was a great
I was actually kind of shocked at how small the statue was, because in the picture, when I looked at it online, it looked like a bigger statue. But
I think it's like the third statue, quite honestly, because poor Amanda kept getting stolen. And artists replacing her. So I noticed that the last time we were there, she had a detector, like a GPS detector attached to her.
Yeah, I saw that. But that's probably necessary. You know? I mean, and it's also on private property, right?
Yeah, I think she is at the end of the trail. It does end, or a logging company maybe, or like BLM or something.
Yeah, but I will tell you what, it's worth it. If you're in, it's worth going there and being part of that. Even if you come around the other trail, like we met Heidi and her family. I went out with Kevin Finnegan and Jerome Aber, and we hiked in to do like a little thing about 3/11 Fukushima with Heidi and her family. And we came in the other way. We're not as familiar with the trail, so I guess we went in the back way, and the hike in was really not very far, maybe a half a mile in and a half a mile out, right?
Yeah, I think from the top down it's like 2 miles, but
Yeah, and so I didn't even see how we got to that road. That wasn't something that my GPS told me where to go. You know what
yeah.
I mean?
No, it was cool that we found each other though, and it was cool that we
Yes.
got to sit with her, and I did think a lot on that trail. I was thinking just about how like this coastline is the front line to Fukushima,
Yes.
and just how much Fukushima, is affecting. I remember one time, Lonnie, I met this woman from Japan, and she had evacuated because of Fukushima. And she had come to Hanford with me. We were driving around, and she's just like could not believe how like developed it was in these gigantic houses and just like how beautiful it was. And she's like, didn't they ever evacuate? Like, have they ever evacuated here? And I was like, well, no, because if they evacuated, they'd have to say there was an accident. And the whole idea is that they have control of everything. I'm like, this is the worst waste site as far as I know in the world, maybe the northern hemisphere, but I know it's the worst waste site in the northern hemisphere, and it's never talked about evacuating or even really being in danger there.
You mean at Richland?
Yeah, and 10 miles from the gate.
You mean
and
they've never talked about evacuation in Richland from any of the accidents that have happened there?
I think that there's evacuations on the property. Like I know I read when the tunnel just collapsed this week that they, or whatever week it was that they collapsed, that the workers were sent home. But no, they don't like sound alarms in town and be like, drop and cover, No, everything's fine. Eat your contaminated apples.
There's
Don't
only
worry about
15 miles away from there, though. There's like a 25. Isn't there like a minimum 25 diameter radius when you have
from the gate?
Well, I mean, for the evacuation zone from whatever site there is, isn't there a 25-mile evacuation zone?
I think that's to the gate. I've never heard of anyone evacuating outside of the gate. I remember once when we lived there in 2011.
Do people live within 25 miles of the plant? That like
people. Well, so the plant. So there's different parts of it. We can go on and on about parts of it, but there's like the active generator, the CGN, the Columbia Generating Plant, which is the actual reactor, and that's like 10 miles from the gate to Hanford. But then there's the waste site and the tunnels, and I believe the tunnels are about 25 miles from the gate. But once you walk out of that gate, there's offices and houses everywhere. There's people right up to the gates of Hanford. You can farm up to the gate of Hanford. Like, Hanford's 500, I think it's 500 miles altogether square.
Yeah, 510 or 513 square miles.
There's like if you go to like drive into Hanford, there's like real gates and guards, but the rest of it's just barbed wire fence. And like I've been in Pasco where there's potato farms right outside of White Bluffs, and you're like at the potato farm to the barbed wire fence, and then past that barbed wire fence is the waste site. So it's not like what you would imagine at all. Safety zones.
Are they burying waste up to the fence? Don't they bury it more towards the center? I mean, isn't that the idea?
No, okay, so the buried waste is more inside the fence, Lonnie, but like an example is like they do this tour once a year where you can get to go in and see the B reactor, because the B reactor is like a national monument, because it was like
they actually closed down that tour yesterday.
Oh, did they?
Yes.
Well, so years ago so I got married, had kids, and we moved back to my family farm, and that's a whole story in itself. But my husband didn't really understand about it at all, so I sent him on the B reactor, and he came home and literally like got naked after the tour and like burned his clothes, and he was like, "We got to move right now," and he was so dramatic. He really was that dramatic, because he said that like one side of the fence, the chain link fence, they said was safe, but the other side of the chain link fence that they were walking by to get to the B reactor, they said was highly radioactive. And there was a windstorm, and he said that the dust just blew from where they were digging the hole right to where they all were, and just like dusted them all on their faces as they're going into
the... Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and he was horrified because he has a geology background, so he understands how dirt also can hold elements, and dirt is elements. So,
You
oh
should
gosh.
write a story to Senator Patty Murray because she worked on getting that opened.
Well, her dad was a vet, and she comes from the different worlds of
That
mine where
doesn't
her,
matter. She needs to
you know,
understand the level of fear that she's perpetrating on people.
and she thinks she's putting honor and jobs into people. Like,
Look,
that's the,
I mean, we can make it a monument, but you shouldn't be giving tours. That's bull. No, nobody should be out in the dirt out there.
well, you shouldn't call dirt safe if it's not safe. And, you shouldn't be growing potatoes in dirt that just, had radiation spread all over it either. But we do things that we shouldn't do, and usually it's because of money. So that's kind of what I've always done, is follow the money trail. But the bite in the butt on that is that they keep asking for more money because they want to clean it up. And I'm too jaded now. And so when I see that they need more money, I think it's for dinner parties and catered lunches. You know what I mean? And not for the work that needs to be done. And so that's almost the first
Don't
place
forget
you got
their
to start.
Mercedes. They need their Mercedes and BMWs.
So much waste, crazy waste. And we're running out of time, but I wanted to bring up the whole medicine access because you were talking about this healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And
well,
it
we
is
have an extra
so,
few minutes. I think we scheduled, 45 minutes?
Yeah, so my timer, 2 minutes.
Okay, well, add like another 5 minutes because we do have an hour on the show, so.
Okay.
Because that would be interesting to hear.
So, about access to healthcare, there is none. There really is none. There's one of the largest in the I don't know what era you call that, between 2000 and 2010, the 2000s or whatever era. They put in one of the largest cancer research sites in Kennewick.
Wow.
And there's lots of hospitals there, but if you aren't, it's just really weird healthcare. It's really weird. And an example of that is I know a young woman who was lived in Tri-Cities her whole life, and she's raised her kids, and she works hard. And last year, she started getting a cyst on her nose, on the bridge of her nose, and she could not get into a doctor. And then once she finally got into a doctor, she couldn't afford the labs. And then, it took a year to find out that it wasn't a cancerous cyst, but it was benign. But then it took almost a half year for her to even be able to save the money and work to pay to have it removed. And so this poor woman, and so you always hear about cancer causing, or radiation causing cancer, but you don't really hear about how radiation just causes mutations and like cellular benign mutations.
Well, this is the thing. We know John Goffman said there are 4 direct things that low-level exposure to low-level radioactivity that we can anticipate in our society. We know this is going to happen. They told us this in the 50s and 60s and 70s.
Well, they don't tell us that there. That's the thing. Is it's not like you see little brochures that are like, what for these 4 signs?
This is an autoimmune deficiency thing. It's the same thing. It's like these are breakdowns in your system. And diabetes, schizophrenia, this is there for real.
Right. Mental health. Yeah, mental health is huge. My dad's example of that.
Well, schizophrenia is a medical condition. It's not just like you're emotionally distraught and you can create a sense of well-being. With schizophrenia, your chemistry's off and you need some help because your brain goes out of whack at a certain time. Thank goodness we know a lot about schizophrenia, but it is caused by low-level radioactivity. So people do not have to blame themselves and say, oh, what's wrong with our family? We have all these schizophrenics in our family. Blah, blah, blah. No, it was done to us in the 50s and in the 40s since they started knowing about nuclear. To be honest, John Goffman said they were testing babies in the 1900s, and not if you were born in a hospital in a city where they were testing nuclear and the radiation, your child got radiated when it was an infant. That's why a lot of those children died.
The solution to pollution is dilution.
Yeah,
so when they had all this radiation, the more they spread it around, the more they couldn't blame where it came from.
That's right.
And now what we have is a worldwide contaminated environment, and we're still pointing fingers, but we have to get past the blame. And we need to start taking care of ourselves,
Exactly. Let's be human and love each other.
Is how you do it. It's all about information. Mm-hmm. That's why I appreciate this radio show, Lonnie, and I appreciate so much of what you do, because it's all just about bringing it out into the light and letting people start thinking about it and forming their own opinions, and researching it themselves. And then they'll learn, because there is a lot to know about it.
There is a lot to learn, and I am not interested in saying that I used to think nuclear was the worst thing in the world, but I am willing to bend a little bit on that one and say if we could change the science, the focus of the science, instead of being nuclear weapons and make it nuclear remediation. Okay, and then we can use the benefit. This is what John Goffman said. This is what his studies, this is what he and Arthur Tamplin and Linus Pauling said to the U.S. government. This is a great technology, but do not use it widely until you figure out what to do with the nuclear waste, because it is toxic and it kills and it never goes away. And this is how, and he literally in his book, he said, Congressman Hollingsworth said to him, who was a very prominent congressman in the 60s and 70s, he said, that cannot be the answer. We need a different answer. I'm not going to go into the committee and tell them that.
Right.
And so this is where it started. The people from the military who had military interests, because in the 60s and 70s they were building up our nuclear arsenal secretly and doing it very effectively. The whole thing, we need to just have the courage to talk out loud about the things that have happened, and I hope to do it without anger, because the anger doesn't get us anywhere. We just need to say, okay, basta, we're stopping. We're going to go back to being human beings, and we want our children educated. We want free health care. We want free education, and we want some type of reconciliation where we just start telling the truth, and that means the International Atomic Energy Agency has got to redo its contract with the World Health Organization and stop censoring them. This is why we don't know about the harm that that they are doing medically, because the IAEA has the ability and the authority to say, we don't want you to put this in this report, and you can't talk about this until, because we've got other priorities, and so you can't say it until we want you to say it. They don't tell them they can't say it. They just say you can't publish it until we're ready to let you publish it.
Right.
So this is where they get around with the double talk and all that. And, the Independent World Health Organization, they were all these medical doctors who joined, and they did a 7-day vigil every day for 25 years. They just recently closed up.
Wow.
Yes. And so the nuclear industry is winning because they're beating people down. And my goal is to get people to go. I even, I meet people, elderly people, I'm 63, but I mean people who look I know they're 65, but they look way older than me. But they're like, sorry about that.
Yes.
But they're like,
child at heart right there. You'll be 80 years old and you're going to feel like you're 9,
Exactly. Anyways, they're like, yeah, well, I walked across the country and, they did stop the nuclear power plants from being built. But you know what I said? We need you back in this fight. We need you to pay attention. We need your comments. This is getting serious. This stuff is getting serious because it is getting into our food supply, our water supply, and we have the potential to build the science to remediate it and not let it be horrible. I actually believe in the universal love of God, to be honest. I don't think that we are going to be thrown to the wind. I think that we will be able to figure our way out of this, but we've got to put some money into it, and we've got to have some truth, reconciliation, love, honor, integrity, have a bit of modesty,
No, this is a classic case of love versus evil, for sure, and greed. This is what it's made about, for sure.
Well, that's why I say happiness is resistance, because the people that want to oppress us and want us to believe that, it's really easy to control people who are unhappy. And it's sad that I grew up in an unhappy childhood, but you know what? I was a happy child because I realized early on, I came into this. I didn't make this. and I was not
Yeah,
responsible
and you got to choose
for it.
it.
It was so extreme.
Yeah.
You know, my childhood was an extremely not a happy one. And so with my own children, I made an effort to give them a safe, happy home. And my girls are very secure human beings, you know, and that's what we need is people who can be loving. We need to love each other and treat each other humanely and kindly, mostly to ourselves. You know, self-love recovery. We need people to just really embrace loving themselves so that they can face these things and get actively engaged, because it may be activism, it may be getting an education, it might be getting therapy so you can handle facing it. You know what I mean? It may be.
I hope we feel so positive and loving.
Yes, and changing your eating habits to honor your body. Refuse to put chemicals and plastics into your body, because then you're just eating the oil company stuff, like that creamer. You know, that creamer that those chemicals and all that creamer stuff, when you read it, it tastes really yummy. You buy it in the refrigerated section.
Creamer, yeah.
That stuff, oh my gosh, macchiato caramel something. And you look on the side and it's got all these like hydro blah, 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 blah. That's just byproducts of oil. Those are oil byproducts. You're putting oil into your body.
You know, they will sell us poison and not even bat an eye.
They're not botanical. Like, I'm a meat eater. I do not eat fish anymore, though, because I still can't get past Fukushima.
That's a whole nother radio show right there. We'll get into that next time. But I do
eat picky meat. I am picky about the meat, but I do get it that it's, and but I'm just saying, I don't think we should eat anything but plant and animal. I'm not interested in eating man-made products, including, you know what I mean, oil and radioactivity. Thank you, but no.
Oh, Lonnie, it's always so good to talk to you. I'm sad that we're at an end.
Well, good. Well, I'm glad that you're going to be my co-host. I'm going to remind you, this is not just an interview, Heidi. Heidi's been a guest of mine on my previous show on UCY.tv. And I took a few hiatus getting my show back up on air, but I'm doing it for KEPW, and I do post it up on Spreaker and on my YouTube channel. And I appreciate all of my listeners, and I appreciate my YouTube channel listeners, because I like my YouTube listeners. I have been negligent in connecting and communicating with them because I've been so busy with work and doing the radio podcast. And I am actually editing Libby Halevi's show out, taking out her promotion so it can be on the nonprofit. And so I'm saying this out loud so that if any other nonprofit radio stations out there hear this and want to have Nuclear Hot Seat on your show without her self-promotion.
Or Age of Fission.
Well, I don't ask for money on my show ever. So, but she does, right?
You don't have to do
but I take it out so that it can be on KEPW, because it's super important that people hear her show. It is fabulous. And you can listen to her show on KEPW.org if you're live streaming. Or you can, if you're in Eugene and Springfield, you can listen in on 97.3 FM LP. And it's a community-sponsored radio station, and this is our membership drive month. It ends October 31st. If you want a T-shirt that says KEPW with our magnificent logo on the back of it, it's from Eugene Peaceworks. Give us a donation of $5 a month. Go online to www.kepw.org. and tell us what size T-shirt you want, male or female. We'll get it out to you. And that's for anybody who gives us a membership. Anywhere in the world, we'll still get it to you. So,
and you can still stream.
That's
stream
right.
Anywhere.
And if you're in Eugene, Oregon, we definitely need your support. And we really love that we're getting such a good response from people about our station. It's very unique. Go look at our schedule. It's very unique. We're the only station I know that has Spanish-speaking radio shows during the day on a station that's really run by people who don't speak Spanish, giving voice to people. Yeah, it's very interesting. We have 3 shows, and so we do a show on legalized survival about homelessness and houselessness and the issues they have to face and the things they go through. They interview people who are houseless, and they talk about what their needs are and what their plight is, and kind of like what I do here. So
very cool.
Heidi, thank you. I can't wait till the next week.
Next Saturday.
Yes, and
let's do it.
Thank you, everybody, and we will talk to you soon. Put your courage feet on.
Bye, Lonnie.
Bye, you guys. The Age of Fission radio show brings you book readings, pertinent articles, interviews with both activists and victims of nuclear and environmental contamination. We strive to deliver only the facts from reliable sources. We want to remind you that love is greater than fear, and happiness is resistance. Our dedication to love and happiness paves the road for innovation and healing. As we face our harsh reality, let us hold each other up and rejoice in our humanity. If you want to comment, please send your thoughts to ageoffission@gmail.com. That's AGEOFFISSION @gmail.com. To your host, Lonnie Clark.